Professionally, I'm a senior policy advisor and public policy professional working in the Ontario government. That's my main job for quite a while. I've worked in more notable equity spaces. For example, at the Chief Coroner's Office, I was the project lead for Ontario's Pediatric Death Review Committee, focusing on an equity-based approach to analyzing our child welfare-related deaths and making recommendations. Currently, right now, I'm at the Ministry of the Attorney General, working on a mental health strategy for well-being and training for our staff. This includes Crown attorneys, lawyers, judges, court clerks even, so whatever have you. And my academic persona, as I like to think about it, if you want that boring bio, I am a social and psychiatric epidemiologist. My work primarily focuses on developing psychosocial interventions within low resource or emergency settings. I'm also working from home today, so if you see my eyes darting to the side, that's where my work laptop is. So today my talk is mainly focusing on centering lived experience as a form of important pedagogy when working within the context of healthcare education. And I'm going to draw on a case study that features students from my class that I teach. So one of the things that's something that many of us are probably familiar about is the COVID cohort. Something that I've been thinking a lot about and having conversations with other educators is that this generation of younger students or young people have experienced their world essentially being flipped upside down. And sometimes we kind of see this group of students and the way that they interact with us as they have certain types of difficulties or challenges that we did not encounter with other types of students that we've taught, right? And oftentimes the conversation comes up like many of these students struggle to have conversations, they struggle to work in groups, and they have a low tolerance for certain things. But when I kind of took a step back and I thought about this, I'm like, why am I thinking about my students, these young adults, in a very particularly negative way? And then I kind of, like I said, I took a step back and I realized, no, these young individuals have been exposed to some of the most horrifying publicized events in their lives. They do not have a low tolerance for having poor social skills or capacity. They just have a low tolerance for injustice. And we see this a lot when they are more likely to voice their opinions about some things not being fair for each other in class or even outside. And so that was something that I was really, really reflecting on and thinking about, what am I going to bring today's keynote in? What am I going to tell you about today? My goal is not to leave you with answers or solutions. It's actually to give you more questions on how we think about assessments and how we think about formalized education with anti-racism pedagogies. So when we think about traditional assessments, many of us probably can agree with these things. Grades are instruments of control and exclusion, specifically about who gets accepted into programs, who gets to participate fully and within their whole selves. Traditional assessments reproduce systemic bias and inequities, such as in terms of formalized writing and standards of writing, right? For example, the use of M dashes previously was very common, but now with generative AI, M dashes are a very common thing. So even in terms of, there may be, I've seen this quite a lot with the racialized students, they consistently being dinged for using AI, even though that an AI detector was not used for their program or their course. And they're being bogged down and saying hey, my faculty doesn't think that I can write that well, but I've written this well my entire life. So what's going on over here? And one of the other key things is, with traditional assessments, it prioritizes performance over learning and care. More specifically, students are more likely to go to say, okay, what's the highest number that I can get from the rubric versus actually digesting the content and going forward with this. So in terms of framing my talk, there's 3 anchor points that I want to think about with you all. Ungrading is a philosophy of care within our classrooms. Anti-racism pedagogy and why it's necessary within healthcare education, depending on wherever you are. If you're teaching from midwifery programs, if you're teaching med students, or if you're teaching undergrads who typically are in a pre-med pathway. And lastly, experience-centered learning as a form of transformative justice within our classrooms. So when we think about ungrading, many of us probably have thought about this or even were tempted to apply it. I think about ungrading as a shift in power, specifically about having a dialogue within students and yourself. So when we go from evaluation, just assuming what grades are how a student can achieve and how when we put those final grades in for approvals, to thinking about how students are engaging with the course content. So ungrading essentially recognizes students as active agents, as their experience, and also active learners and how they're digesting our content. It removes the hierarchy of the expert versus learner, and it focuses on feedback, reflection, and collaboration as a way of students to get engaging with the content. There is a quote by Alfie Cohen, who many of you are probably familiar with if you associate ungrading with him. Then the absence of grades is the necessary, though not sufficient, condition for promoting deep thinking and desire to engage in it. So why does all of this matter in health education, specifically when we think about racism as a determinant of health? A very key thing that I think about with my students is that I want them to experience a type of education that is centered on their lived experience, especially in my class I'm going to be talking about. And when we understand that racism is a determinant of health, this comes from policies and structures and how decisions are made about which hospital sectors get funded, which regions do not get funded. It also boils down to how med schools operationalize curriculum components that have to do with equity or priority deserving populations. And it also comes down to the classroom about how students are taught certain topics, right? It also standardizes assessments and privileged dominant norms. And future professionals have to be equipped for justice-oriented practice and thinking more reflexively about their content rather than just passively digesting things. And lastly, ungrading fosters empathy, reflexivity, and humility, which are key components to building well-intentioned healthcare providers for the future. An example that I can give you is I was asked to do a workshop for a med school, and this was part of the certificate program that they were running. I was asked to do a workshop that can be my workshop specifically focused on critical psychiatry, specifically from a cross-cultural perspective. And I was going to take them through the genesis of the diagnostic standard manual, essentially about how culture came into being and how that kind of shapes how we think about culture and assessments for psychiatric reasons. And I think the first question that I asked them, like, how many of you guys actually know about the culture formulation interview tool that is used in the back of the DSM? And nobody raised their hand. And coincidentally enough, they actually just finished their psychiatry block as part of the program. And this was not covered because it was not necessary. And I was just thinking, it's like if these doctors went ahead and they continued on wherever that they were going, they probably would have struggled to diagnose some clients and racialized clients specifically. And this has unintended consequences in terms of the diagnosis and also the prognosis of the individual, whatever that they're experiencing. So this is a question that I have for you to think about. What would healthcare education look like if lived experience was treated as evidence? For example, many of us are probably familiar with randomized control trials as the gold standard of producing and generating knowledge. But what good is that when somebody who's experienced intergenerational trauma from residential school is at your door and in front of you? How are you going to work with that client or individual? So what does an anti-racist pedagogy look like? It moves from going beyond inclusion and saying, oh, we want to make sure that certain voices of communities that have been disenfranchised are included within our curriculum, and thinking a bit forward from that, thinking towards transformation, what that would look like. So an anti-racism pedagogy has a few components that I've been thinking about over the core years, and also with the research that I've done with my class as well. It names and confronts racism directly. Very explicitly, it uses the terms white supremacy, it uses the words racism. It does not fluff anything out and saying individual differences or cultural differences. It centers lived experiences and structural analysis of approaching a problem that is happening. It challenges epistemological racism. For example, whose knowledge counts and what type of research and materials that you're giving to your class. Is it just journal articles, or are you also including podcast episodes? Are you including blog posts, Twitter threads, Instagram information posts, or things like that, right? And challenging what exactly whose knowledge counts towards providing you a wholesome education associated with this topic. And lastly, it moves beyond diversifying the syllabus and not just including, oh, we need authors from a specific background to be included, to actually thinking about, wait, why are authors from certain communities missing in the first place when we're thinking about this composite issue at the end of the day, and having those active conversations with their students about why certain readings were intentionally picked. So the case study that I'm going to be speaking about today is racism in health. this is my baby, this is my class, this is an undergraduate course offered at McMaster. We intentionally made it so that there's no prerequisites for students to come in, so they can come in and take it wherever from whatever program that they're in. It's not individualized to the health sciences program at McMaster. So I had students from political science, pharmacy, students from everywhere essentially coming into my class, which made for a more fulsome and rich discussion. This class actually came as a consequence of the university's commitments because of what had happened with the murder of George Floyd. And one of the things that this is a fundamental commitment towards students because students protested for requiring courses associated with this. And every year, whenever I start my class, I start off with saying, like, this class only exists because those who came before you wanted to have a class like this, because we understand that issues related to our communities are always put at the end of any type of class that you attend. So we have a class for ourselves, and I want to make sure that this class acknowledges your lived realities and experiences that you bring to the table. And I recognize that many of you come to this class that are experts in the topics that we're going to cover, and the grading has to reflect that. Therefore, ungrading and anti-racist pedagogies come hand in hand and associated in recognizing that many of my students come from a place that have experience and are knowledgeable about these things. And there's also a hybrid delivery, which is very intentional. And I understand that some programs are not allowing this, but the hybrid delivery is important for accessibility and safety. For example, many of my students, who often end up being, the majority of them are racialized, have other commitments such as caretaking or working extra jobs, which is the reality for many racialized individuals and students who are pursuing post-secondary education. So this becomes a bit more flexible for them and accessible. So the course is designed in 3 ways, essentially 3 chunks of sections, and it's a scaffolding type of learning approach. We cover key foundations of, like, basically topics and socializing to key existing frameworks that exist. We also talk about application, about how this works in real life, like, for example, what our healthcare system, how that's set up. And lastly, we cover critical issues. Like, we have a wide variety, I think like 7 weeks worth of, like, different issues like incarceration, reproductive justice, environmental racism, city planning, immigration. And so it's to acknowledge that, you know, racism in health is not just what a patient experiences when they come into a waiting room or into your assessment room. It is broadly, and it acknowledges that step back, right? So when we think about assessments in this class, so I think about assessments as liberation. So the assignments, they're reflection papers, there's pass fail, and it's asking students to reflect on their own experiences about why did you even want to take this class? What do you want to get out of it? There's also a policy brief or a myth infographic that I shuffle between every year. This is more of a group-based assignment that requires them to unpack and think about, where is this issue structurally located? How can we unpack this? And lastly, there's a student conference presentation that happens with the group presentations. We do a conference, and this is important for 2 reasons, because something that I learned very early on is that many of my students, unfortunately, do not get opportunities to present at research conferences. So this gets them aligned on their CV, which is very fundamental when you understand and recognize and take a step back that many racialized students are systemically disenfranchised in many ways. So I try to include ideas and opportunities like this where they can get items on their CV. And as part of our student conference, we also have keynote presenters as well. Students nominate themselves. So these are just some aspects of assessment and opportunities that are very creative-based assignments for them to think outside of the box rather than having rote memorization of topics as well. So in thinking about centering lived experiences as a source of knowledge, some key principles that really guide my work is that students' own experiences are valid data. For example, many of them talk about, I had a loved one that unfortunately passed away because of systemic neglect that they experienced at a hospital setting, which is a very common topic that gets spoken about in my class. And this allows students to connect personal, professional, and systemic realities about recognizing that whatever that you experience was not just a one-off event, it's connected to bigger things at the end of the day within our sociopolitical context. And it encourages empathy and reflexivity and social accountability for students and saying, well, what am I going to do after once this class is done? So in the classroom, the discussions, like, they invite students to link the readings or lived or observed experiences. Every week we have a case study that's real life examples within Canada locally, so they can get that ingrained idea about how do we deconstruct this, why did this happen. I invite guest speakers who are not just academics, but actually professionals who are community organizers or healthcare professionals of some capacity to come in and talk about their experience, which is a bit more different than having an academic come in. And the creative assignments, like the storytelling that we do, helps them connect a lot of their theory to their context. And the impact that I've kind of thought about for the past like 6 years of teaching this class is like many students actually think about this as a relational space and not just a structural space that they come into the classroom. So these are just some posters that I picked over the past years of our conference that we've done. And, you know, the students get really involved as part of this process. And it's always wonderful seeing them at the end of the day to shine and see what type of issues that they're talking about and what they would like to present on. So when we think about formally assessing my class, I really, really highly suggest this. If you have like a institute of learning or any something similar to that on your campus, I highly suggest for you to invite them in and come in and do a formalized assessment of your class, specifically in talking about different type of pedagogical strategies that you can employ and what you've been trying to work on and how to make sure students are engaged with whatever issues that you're encountering. So at McMaster, there's the McPherson Institute. So I had them come in and I asked them very targeted questions about what does an anti-racist pedagogy look like for this class and what students think about it and what do they imagine. And some key themes came out for many students. They were like, you know, having this type of step back and thinking about, you know, grades are not the end all be all for them. It reduces their stress and anxiety. They have opportunities to focus on other things. It increased their creativity and collaboration. Like they had more commitment towards their peers when they're working within group settings, when we understand group assignments can be highly contentious for many individuals because certain personalities conflict. And also the most important part that came out was very, very strong and evident, the validation of having lived experience and seeing that a instructor at the front is telling them, no, you're the expert in whatever that we're talking about. And this has to be acknowledged because students long before you fought for a class like this to exist. So it gives that type of ownership to students when they come to class and saying like, okay, I'm responsible for myself in this class. I understand that this class was made for me and I have to do whatever that I need, the work that I need to put in is what I get out of it. So in terms of the lessons learned, there's some things that I really, really have some big takeaways. Like just because there's flexibility in my class, that does not mean that there's a lack of rigor, especially with ungrading. Many of us, our peers probably have automatically assumed this, but actually ungrading, it fosters a lot of depth when you have this placed in for students to think about this content. And accessibility and care are anti-racist acts and forms of pedagogy. For example, having anti-ableist or more accessible forms where students don't have to fight for getting an accommodation for a class, it goes a long way, and it has to be acknowledged that this is an anti-racist practice as well. And institutional support is crucial for sustainability of these different like flexible types of approaches to teaching and learning. One of the key components for health sciences at McMaster is that it's a problem-based learning type of style that is employed a lot within the courses in the program. So of course, my class would not be possible unless there was institutional support for these practices to exist in the first place. So some challenges and realities that came out of it. Obviously, I think a really key one is that, you know, for navigating institutional expectations, like there's rubrics and policies and there's like certain stigmas associated with particular programs that might be seen as a bit too easy and what that would look like. But unfortunately, many of this is not an easy sell or fix at the end of the day. And you just have to work what works best. Some context, my class is a size of like 50. Now I think it's 70. So you can still do ungrading and flexible and creative practices in larger group settings and have this still deep, rich engagement with students who still come up and show up to class every day. For example, many of you experience attrition throughout the semester, like students not showing up. Attendance is not mandatory in my class, but those 50 students still show up at the end of the day throughout the entire semester, which is because they see themselves acknowledged and reflected in the classroom space. So the vision and thinking about transforming healthcare education, this means valuing experience as evidence and acknowledging straight off the bat, or understand that whatever that we're talking about today comes from a place that you may already have experience with. And teaching anti-racism is not a specific form of clinical competence, but as a practice form of humility that they can encourage. Oftentimes within the healthcare space, we see cultural competence or whatever have you, but understanding that no one can truly be competent and that's okay to acknowledge. But more specifically, we want individuals to understand that if you don't know something, that's perfectly fine. We'll work a way towards that. And that drives for better engagement for patient and clinical encounters as well. And obviously redefining excellence through equity and care. Did you show up to class today and you had a really important think about like, you know, the content that we covered? That's more important for me versus like you trying to make sure that everything is APA correct in your citations and references when they submit an assignment, right? So this is a cycle that I have been thinking about a lot about experience-centered pedagogy and instructional design. And it's like a cycle, obviously, as the way that I've displayed it. And it starts with experience. So your personal community or professional encounters with inequity of care. Think about yourself personally, what have you encountered, but also think about your students, what they may have encountered. And thinking about lived realities as a valid starting point and thinking about instructional design or even the assignments that you give to your students. Then there's reflection, so critical self-examination of assumptions of privilege and power, and asking, how does this shape my understanding of health and justice? Whose voices are left out when I'm picking the readings or even thinking about the content that I'm showing to my class, right? Then it moves into theory and dialogue. So this integrates course materials, scholarship, and peer discussion, and how you go about that in the assignments that you pick, and also connecting the structural analysis to individual experience, like why are the case studies that I'm picking, how can I just not just isolate them as like one-off medical experiences or actually connecting them? Wait a minute, there was a specific policy that was enacted, for example, when we think about grassy narrows in Canada that had to do with an Indigenous community experiencing environmental racism. Where did this start, right? And asking them the bigger questions associated with that to drive deeper engagement. And lastly is praxis, so basically putting everything into action. So your application through creative assignments, advocacy, or clinical practice, and every single time that you run a class or run an engagement or an evaluation, you re-enter this entire cycle with new experiences and awareness, and that makes you shift and think about, okay, what can I do better next time? How can I think about dialogue and associated with my students in building better engagement? So, and what's next after this, right? Like, after all these conversations, many of you are probably thinking about, okay, I don't know what I want to do with this, but like one of the key things is about centering lived experience, and confronting racism is not an add-on, as many people often end up doing for their pedagogy or even curriculum design or even the assignments that they pick. It's a radical reimagining of what it means to teach, learn, and heal within the classroom. Something that I will always take away and something that I always think about in my classes, like given everything that is happening in the world and what's going on, what is the point of me coming up and teaching racism and health? What is something new that's going to happen? But I always recognize and think many of my students are young people who want to create changes in the world. And this classroom is often the only, sometimes the first time that they have, and seeing like, wait a minute, whatever that I experienced actually was not a one-off thing. It's connected to everything bigger. And this is how I can go about making a change. If I end up still going to med school, because being a physician assistant, or even if I end up changing and doing another degree for becoming a lawyer. So, you know, thinking about lived experience as a key fundamental in ungrading as anti-racist pedagogy, it's not just a nice thing to have, it radically does translate and transform students' experiences. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Zoha. Very thought-provoking, I think. You know, that while people put their questions, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat and or comments, and I'll share them. While people are thinking about that, I had two questions. One, what is the myth infographic? Can you flesh that out a little bit and tell us what the myth infographic is? And secondly, how prepared are students to do the written reflections? Do they,
right.
Do you have to teach them how to do that? Do they, you know, is reflection a skill that they come equipped to do? So my two questions.
Those are really good questions, especially about the second one. And it speaks to the broader healthcare education that many undergrads and pre-med pathways go. But for the myth infographic, like all the assignments that they're given are things that they've never ever done before in their typical program. So they're very creative. The myth infographic requires them to think about what's a common misconception or myth that they might be familiar with associated with racialized individuals. Like a common one that I can probably say is that Indigenous populations are predisposed to alcoholism, right? And then they break down the myth and why is this myth, where did this myth come from? Why is this myth important to bust? What are the actual facts and statistics associated with this? And how can we challenge the myth at different levels, whether through education, through policy, whether through increasing funding and whatever have you. So it's a lot of going back to not just challenging it as a healthcare myth, but challenging as where did this myth's like genesis start from? And so much of it comes for settler colonialism. So it's a really fun myth. It can be applied to any types. Like I've seen it also done in a class on aging in healthcare as well. And it's a really good way for people to check and see like, okay, these are institutional biases that we're probably familiar with, but how can we actually, be better healthcare providers when we're engaging patients or in the clinic that come from these particular backgrounds, right? Because they're not going to learn this when they go off to med school. In fact, like some of the horror stories that I've heard when I've done workshops in med schools is that some of this content is still being taught today. Like there's this infamous nursing textbook that many of us are probably familiar with that had a chapter about pain management, what that looks like in different populations. And it was just mortifying knowing that this stuff is still continuing and it leads at risk for killing people, from certain communities. And then in terms of the reflection, like there's guided questions that I do give, like, why do you care about this class? What do you want to do? And for many of them, they're like, I've never been asked to think about myself in the health sciences program or the kinesiology program. And it invokes this bigger conversation about who are you in relation to the content that we're learning? Because I don't want you to be a passive observer in the class. I want you to acknowledge that you come over here with gifts, you come over here with strengths, and this is a way for you to put that on paper.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think it's fascinating, that how things have changed and students' response to that question. No, I haven't been asked to do that before. I think is, speaks so much about the culture, perhaps, of higher education. And I was talking to someone who said that students think they have to write it or speak in a certain way because they're in higher education. Do you know that there's a formality to it, or they don't just write or speak like they would normally? And so I think what you're doing is freeing that up for students, saying, no, your voice is completely valid and authentic and important. So
yeah,
I think really interesting work.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Zoha, especially because as a healthcare provider myself, as a practitioner, a clinical practitioner, I think all the assessment so far has been so focused on skills, on hands-on activities. And we have forgotten the human part of being a healthcare provider and how the health system and the health education system, it is forming healthcare providers that are humane. The fact that we have to critically think about this racism or any other critical theories around like how humane has been treated, it really engaged someone to take in consideration how good they have to be on their hands-on skills. So if you care about it and if you really reflect on how you're treating a person, that you pay the attention and you take the time to develop those skills that come hands-on. So that's the reason I was so happy to have Zoha today as a keynote speaker. And then it's just a radical way to frame healthcare education that is not only focused on practical things, but also going back into what healthcare really is and focus on human-centered and then assessment from a different way. And then so thank you for your radical ways of thinking.
It's great. We're going to move on.